transferring to our other guests, the Mayor of Lower Hutt, Ray Wallace. Needed to say it's an abject, almost universal denial. I'm very fortunate that we have a mayor here who's willing to come and listen to what we have to say and to take that on board. So, Inga mana, inga reo, inga karanga, tanga raurana, tina mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor, kia ora and good evening. It's my very great pleasure to be here, firstly as Mayor of Lower Hutt, but also as a local resident and concerned resident of the Greater Wellington region. I was invited along by Robin, and I want to congratulate you, Robin and Pam, for organising this event. I think it's a great turnout for a Friday night, fantastic turnout, and obviously it is an issue of concern. As we know, we're extremely lucky to have the Professor come along tonight and talk to us. Just prior to introducing him though, I do want to thank and acknowledge the transition movement, particularly the one that I know of here in the Hut that is doing such good work. I've been to a number of their workshops and their luncheons. The workshops, I can tell you, just so that you are aware, the Mayoress and I, from attending a transition workshop now, have reduced our waste to the landfill by 75%. So we recycle, we reuse, and we compost. We've got 4 big composts around our properties now, and it's amazing. And I'm out there supporting getting the community in behind those sorts of things. We really do need to make sure the community buys into this as well, because it's just so important. Enough from me. It's my very great honour to introduce Professor Guy McPherson, retired from the Arizona University, where he kept a very senior position, but he has given that position up now to become an international presenter and educator on the issues facing us as a planet. So let's put a very warm welcome to
We've got a few people who are hard of hearing and may not hear you at all without the aid of a microphone. So if we can get one of them to work, that would be good. Just give it a little bit longer.
Is Juanita about? Because it's her equipment. I'm not familiar which is the volume switch.
All right. I'm afraid now that you can hear me, you're not going to like it at all, given what I have to say. Everything I'm going to say today, I have said and written at my website, Nature Bats Last, which is at guymcpherson.com, and most recently and comprehensively in my latest book, Walking Away from Empire. If you want a copy of the page proofs of that book, just send me an email message. All my contact information is at guymcpherson.com. Because I think we're headed for a world in which money doesn't matter. Without money, we'll all be rich. because I'd like to get the bad news first and move on to the good news. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their finding that with their fourth assessment in late 2007, we were headed to a 1 degree warmer world by the end of the century. Never mind that we were 0.8 of a degree warmed already by that time. 1 degree is catastrophic, by the way. Beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and non-linear responses that can lead to extensive ecosystem damage. This is perhaps one of the greatest cover-ups of all time. We've known about this for 22 years, and yet we allowed a mainstream neoclassical economist to convince us that 2 degrees was horrific, when in fact 1 degree is horrific. I can't really understand why we trust mainstream neoclassical economists for anything, much less something as important as the living planet. Is this thing coming and going?
This one works now too.
I'm not going to hold them both. You can't convince me. Anybody who wasn't hard of hearing before we got here is going to be by the time we leave, aren't we? Okay, so 1 degrees is truly catastrophic regardless of what we've heard, and we're there. Hadley Center for Meteorological Research, hardly a left-wing organization. This organization was established by Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, and they say that we're headed for a 2 degree warmer world by 2100. Positive feedbacks resulting from 2 degrees warming will lead quickly and inevitably to 6 degrees. And the last time it was 6 degrees warmer on this planet, there were snakes the size of yellow school buses living in the Amazon, and the largest mammal on the planet was the size of a shrew, a mammal about this big. It's because large-bodied mammals, such as us, cannot maintain our body temperatures at wet bulb temperatures that are so high. In addition, even though we experience frequently 6 degree fluctuations when we go in and out of buildings, the really catastrophic effect of warming is going to be on ecosystems. At 6 degrees warmer, in fact, probably by 4 degrees warmer, the oceans are so acidified they don't support plankton. Plankton is the base of the food chain. It's not the pack and save. Plankton provide 50% of the oxygen on this planet. And oceans without plankton is a catastrophic scenario. And we're there well before we get to 6 degrees warming. United Nations Environment Program, relying on more data and more sophisticated models, as with each one of these assessments that comes later, concludes that we're headed to a 3.5 degree warmer world by 2100. That certainly puts the final nail in the coffin of the human experience. Hadley Center for Meteorological Research comes along a year after that previous assessment, says 4 is the new 2, and it's coming by mid-century. I have really bad news. Half a screen left. And I'm going to fill it up. Consistent with the Hadley Center's assessment of 4 degrees warming by mid-century, Global Carbon Project and Copenhagen Diagnosis, at the time of the Copenhagen climate meetings in November 2009, concluded we're headed for a 6 or 7 degree warmer world, respectively. International Energy Agency and their World Energy Outlook put out always the day after Thanksgiving. We call it Black Friday in the United States because it's the biggest shopping day of the year, so nobody notices any other news. They conclude we're headed for a 3.5 degree warmer world by 2035. United Nations Environment Program comes along and says, consistent with that finding, we're headed for more than 5 degrees warmer by 2050. Then the International Energy Agency, in their latest World Energy Outlook, says we're headed 6 degrees by 2035. Wow. This is the biggest news you've never heard. The mainstream media won't cover any of this. Governments of the world are looking the other way. It's just too terrifying. In addition, there's no politically viable approach to dealing with climate change or energy decline. You think your prime minister is going to come on television and say, what we really have to do is completely collapse the industrial economy. And it looks like the only way we can reduce carbon emissions enough to save our species beyond another generation. I don't think that's going to sell with the voters. The really bad news is that none of these assessments include positive feedbacks or self-reinforcing feedback loops. None of them. And we know they're there. We've triggered at least 5 already. The good news is none of them include economic collapse, which is underway and will be complete soon. Everybody laughs nervously. If we include positive feedbacks, I know of only one large-scale assessment in which positive feedbacks are included. And that's the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. They conclude that we're headed for a 16-degree warmer world by 2100. And this is an old assessment. It's undoubtedly well out of date by now. Just when you think there can't be any more bad news, we have a presidential election in the United States, and there's more data. According to the prestigious journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, climate change is irreversible. What the paper actually says is that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now is the minimum amount that will be in the atmosphere for at least the next 1,000 years. So we're at 394 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now. We'll be at 394 parts per million at least for at least the next 1,000 years. United Nations Environment Programs pointed out that during 2008, global carbon emissions increased. Now, during 2008, that was the year of the catastrophic so-called Great Recession. We started calling them Great Recessions because we can't handle the truth. It's actually a depression, but talking about that is a little too depressing. So during 2008, global carbon emissions actually increased. The record was broken in 2009 when carbon emissions increased by 6.2%. 2010, they increased by 6.5% over the previous record. 2011, they increased 3.4% over the previous record. You can see that we're in the exponential phase of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. At this point, and we've known this for a while, only economic collapse prevents runaway climate change. As pointed out by Tim Garrett in a paper in the prestigious climate change journal, Climatic Change. Excuse me. Last time I came to your fair country about 1.5 years ago, I lost my voice on the 3rd day. Couldn't say a word for 4 days. Never saw my wife so happy. Oddly, she left yesterday, even after I lost my voice. I thought that would have kept her here. So we've known for a while that only economic collapse prevents runaway climate change, and we're doing nothing about it. Instead, we're ratcheting up the madness each and every year. Finally, if we look at what the plants are telling us instead of the direct data on temperature, if we look at what the plants are telling us, we compare Henry David Thoreau's extensive, detailed notes from near Concord, Massachusetts, in the northeastern United States, about 45 degrees north latitude. We compare his notes from the 1840s, right before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Most people track that at 1850. If we compare his notes with the notes of the National Phenology Network from the last several years, the plants are telling us that the temperature has increased about 2.5 degrees since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now there's a caveat. This is about 45 degrees north latitude, and the polar regions warm more quickly than the equator. But it's telling that the plants are telling us that it's a lot warmer than our direct measurements of the weather data. Those positive feedbacks I mentioned, we've triggered 5 that I know about. We discovered the first of them in 2010, which is a signature year for climate research. In the journal Science, the leading journal in the scientific community, it was pointed out that beginning in 2010, the Arctic was defrosting because warm Atlantic water was shooting up through the Fram Strait off the north and east coasts of Greenland. Instead of turning south as part of the thermohaline conveyor belt or the Gulf Stream, that warm Atlantic water shot up past the Fram Strait directly into the Arctic. So we have warm water going into the Arctic. Not surprisingly, in 2010, we observed the lowest ice mass in the summer in the Arctic ever recorded. That record was broken in 2011. From various sources, all of them refereed journal literature, we have the peat in the world's boreal forests, all the way from Asia, Northern Europe to North America. We have peat decomposing directly into the atmosphere, going from solid form to a gaseous phase almost instantly. So that decomposition has accelerated substantially within the last few years. As it warms and dries, more carbon is emitted from decomposition of the peat, which means it gets warmer and drier, which causes for more peat to decompose, which makes it warmer and drier. Classic self-reinforcing feedback loop. Also in 2010, researchers went out to Siberia and lit the ground on fire. Researchers found methane vents that were about 30 centimeters in diameter. And with cameras running, you can see this stuff on YouTube. With cameras running, they lit those vents on fire and it made this nice Roman candle. Look, Mom, I made a fire. I was a scientist for a long time. I understand that. You know, scientists are generally unrespected, so we look to our mothers to point out we're doing wonderful things like lighting the world on fire. That was 2010. 2011, the methane vents were a kilometer across. When we talk about nonlinear changes, that's what we're talking about. Going from 30 centimeters across one year to a kilometer across next year. Nobody's lighting those on fire, by the way, because that'll take your eyebrows off. At the same time, the land can be touched off. Methane is coming out of the ocean as well. Starting in 2010 and especially obvious in summer of 2011, methane hydrates or clathrates, those are synonyms, were coming up out of the deep Arctic Ocean, and in 2011 the sea was bubbling. The Arctic Sea looked like champagne. The clathrates were being released so quickly. Methane is 20 to 30 times more powerful a greenhouse gas, molecule for molecule, than carbon dioxide. If we just include methane to the CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, we're at more than 460 parts per million of CO2 equivalent right now. And finally, and again in 2010, the drought in the Amazon was so severe that the Amazon became a net emitter, a net source of carbon to the atmosphere instead of a net sink for the first time ever. The atmosphere is supposed to be a huge carbon sink in the summertime, but in fact, the Amazon was releasing more carbon than the entire United States combined. Because it's so dry, decomposition is proceeding so rapidly. If we just look at one of those positive feedbacks in one region of the country, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group writes that the methane release has gone exponential, starting in, not surprisingly, 2010. So what we see is a bunch of background noise, but an annual signal as methane release increases in the summertime and decreases in the wintertime. And then in 2010, according to Malcolm Light, writing for the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, the methane release went exponential. Now, two other groups, NOAA and NASA, have looked at these same data and have reached different conclusions than this. So it could be that, even though as nearly as I can tell, Malcolm Light has no agenda. He's a retired Earth system scientist. It could be that he's interpreting the data in a different way than other groups are. But what he says is that methane release will accelerate, exponentially release huge quantities of methane into the atmosphere and lead to the demise of all life on Earth before the middle of this century. That's going to be inconvenient. I don't think that's right, by the way, because there are thermophiles living in the deep oceans that are under extreme pressure and extreme temperature, and I suspect they'll still be there hundreds of years from now. So we'll always have Paris? No, we'll always have thermophiles. In any event, it's obvious at this point that only economic collapse prevents runaway greenhouse, and it might in fact be too late. It could be any one of these positive feedbacks that we've triggered will lead to human extinction within a single human generation. It could be. But I don't think we should act that way. I think we should act as if terminating the industrial economy will actually preserve habitat for human beings on this glorious planet for a few more generations. If we act as if it's too late, then that act becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's not. With respect to the industrial economy, it appears that we could be headed for a near-term cessation of an ongoing, relatively long decline. All the macroeconomic data I've seen indicates that we peaked in 1999 or 2000. Not surprisingly, according to BP data, we hit the undulating plateau of oil extraction at the world level in 1998. So 99 or 2000 is when the industrial economy peaked, and it's been on an undulating plateau or a decline since then. According to Societe Generale, a large French bank, they warned their clients as one of 3 equally weighted forecasts on November 18th, 2009, to prepare for global economic collapse within 2 years. Obviously, that didn't happen. The lights weren't out on November 18th, 2011. But this indicates how relatively quickly a large, respectable organization concludes that we could terminate the set of living arrangements. The World Bank pointed out in January of this year that the coming downturn will be worse, they say worse, I say better, than 2008. Bear in mind that in 2008, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, admitted that the industrial economy nearly reached its end in September of 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. He admitted this 2 years later. Not at the time, of course. After the markets had gotten settled down, then he admitted that every bank except one in the United States would have failed had it not been for massive and massively illegal activity by the Federal Reserve Bank and the U.S. Treasury Department. So when the World Bank says the coming downturn will be worse than 2008, what they really mean is that we could be headed for a near-term collapse of the industrial economy of the world. And there's about 80 people on this list, and they agree. And some of these people have been wrong. Some of these people have been wrong many times. Neil Ferguson, the professor of history at Harvard University, there in the name on the upper left, right there. Neil Ferguson said on July 5th, 2010, that the world's industrial economy will be done within 2 years. That would be July 5th, which I think is yesterday, or the day before. And clearly that's not right. The 3 most recent people to make this forecast are the last 3 on the list. Ann Barnhart was a commodities trader specializing in livestock and grains. And when MF Global collapsed in November of last year, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the U.S. federal government refused to enforce the rule of law, she got out. She sent all the money back to her clients and began immediately teaching how to barter. How to survive with a barter-based economy in the future. So she gave up on commodities trading, and she says we're headed for collapse because of hyperinflation by the end of this year. George Soros, the founder of the Open Society Project and multi-bajillionaire, concluded in January of this year that we're headed for collapse by the end of this year. Willem Bitter, the chief economist of Citibank, just 2 weeks ago, said it's game over by the end of this year. And if you look at what's happening in Europe right now, it's not too hard to imagine that when Europe falls, that's 30% of the world's industrial economy, that it could in fact take the rest of the world down with it. What's driving this is energy decline or peak oil. And this is a graph presented by M. King Hubbert in 1956, except he didn't have any of the data points from here to the right. He only had the data points from this 1956 vertical line to the left. And based on those data points, he drew this figure in which he predicted peak extraction would occur in the United States between 1969 and 1970. Sorry, between 1969 and 1971. That's 1970, right there. Peak extraction in the United States. At the time of this presentation, M. King Hubbert predicted that world oil extraction would reach its peak in about a half a century. This is 1956. He's a petroleum geologist working for Shell Oil Company. And according to the data from the from the Energy Information Administration of the U.S. government, we peaked in May of 2005. According to Hubbert's model, we peaked in December of 2005. And according to data from the International Energy Agency, we peaked in 2006. So 50 years ahead of the prediction, Hubbert nailed it to the year, plus or minus a few months, depending on your take on it. The third prediction Hubbert made, besides that U.S. oil extraction would peak between 1969 and 1971, it peaked in 1970. Second prediction is that world oil would peak in about a half a century, and he nailed it. And the third prediction was that in the wake of global oil hitting its peak extraction, there would be significant cultural disruption. You're probably familiar with the Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the collapse of Iceland and Greece and Cyprus and everybody looking for a bailout. These are what I would consider significant cultural disruptions. If we look at the data a bit more closely, we see that the United States peaked in terms of oil extraction in 1970. The United States then took the two steps, politically viable steps, it could take in the wake of no longer being the world's swing supplier of crude oil. The first step it did was drill where we had it. This is the North Slope of Alaska, quite a bit of oil there, never exceeded the peak from the continental United States. And the second thing the United States did was start importing oil significantly. And that's the blue line there. If we smooth the curve a little bit, you see that as of 2008, the U.S. was importing about 70% of its crude oil. So we have two steps, drill baby drill and kill baby kill. People are not giving us that oil except at the point of a gun. So that's how we take it. 3 weeks ago, the African Division of the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense, announced in their AFRICOM report that we now are occupying 14 countries in Northern Africa. 14. We, the United States, we're number one. Interestingly, the United States did not have the world's largest military in 1970. In fact, the world's largest military, the United States was number 3, behind the Soviet Union and China. Now, of course, the United States spends more on its military than the next 15 countries in the world combined. So that's how you get oil. The point of a gun. Drill where you have it, kill where you don't. This is what happens to regions or countries that peak late. This is Mexican petroleum extraction. This is crude plus condensate. It peaked in 2004 and has been in free fall since then. And that's because countries and regions that peak late can take advantage of technology, new technology that allows us to pump salt water into the wells, or in some cases nitrogen, and extend the peak a little bit further. So this is what we're doing at the level of the world as well. We're using enhanced technology to get the oil out of the ground in places that previously could not get the oil out of the ground. You got to find it before you can suck it out of the ground. Oil discovery has been declining since peak discovery in 1964. I read in today's paper, I believe it was, in Wellington, that a huge oil field had been discovered. It's 6 billion barrels. 6 billion, that's a number with an illion on it, so that must be a lot. That's 85 days worth. 85 days. So when you hear these big fields being discovered in the millions or billions of barrels, put it into context. We're burning through 70 million barrels per day at this point. If we smooth the curve beyond 2010, there's the peak in 2005, smooth the curve beyond 2010, assume a 4% annual decline rate, you see that by 2025, we have access to the same oil extraction that we had in 1970 when the world was far less industrialized and far less populated. So half as many people on the planet at that point, and there weren't 35 cars in all of China and India. In fact, that drive to $147.27 oil in July 2008, that was not driven by the United States or Europe. That was driven by the, quote, second world and third world nations. That's where the demand is coming from this time as well. Demand peaked in the United States in 2005, and probably in Europe as well. Again, as I indicated, according to BP data, we hit the undulating plateau of world oil extraction in 1998. That's about right here. So the amount of oil available going to the right is all about the same. The overall peak occurred in 2005, and you see what happens to the price. It goes up because of demand, and then it free falls profoundly because of demand destruction. Went from $147.27 for Brent crude in July of 2008 down to $34.20 6 months later. When it got down below $100, T. Boone Pickens canceled his huge Great Plains wind project because that doesn't pay at less than $100 oil. Matt Simmons canceled his huge wave energy project off the coast of Maine because that doesn't pay at less than $100 oil. So you have to have a sustained high price to drive what most people call derivatives, what most people call alternatives, what I call derivatives, because they're all really derived from oil. It takes a lot of oil to make a solar panel and a wind turbine and all those things. But if you keep the price of oil high for an extended period of time, the industrial economy just keeps grinding along with sand in the gears. So it's a catch-22. In addition, it hardly even matters that we have nearly 1 trillion barrels of crude plus condensate left in the ground. That hardly even matters. What really matters to the industrial economy is price spikes in crude oil. Each global economic recession since 1972 has been preceded by a spike in the price of oil. Spike in the price of oil, right here, 1973. Not surprisingly, after the US peaked in 1970, price spiked in 1973 and produced a recession. Price spiked again in 1979, produced a recession, and so on. And the bigger the spike, the longer lasting the recession. So when these were occurring, there's plenty of oil left in the ground, but the price spiked because of geopolitical factors. Societe Generale's forecast was looking really good because this is $147.27 oil in July of 2008, priced in euros. Priced in euros, it's about 90 euros. And remember, this is the one that almost brought down the industrial economy of the world. And then the price increased again up to about 90 euros in March of last year. That record was broken in April of this year several times. So sustained high oil prices, spikes in the price of oil, are what's driving this thing into the slaughterhouse. And it looked like they're right on track when the price of oil spiked to the same price in euros as it had hit a couple of years earlier. According to Joint Operating Environment 2010 put out by the U.S. Pentagon, there will be no spare oil capacity by 2012. I suspect that's what drove that spike to $126 oil, or 90 euro oil, in March of 2011. They also foresee a 10 million barrel per day gap by 2015. 10 million barrels per day doesn't sound like a lot, but currently we're extracting and delivering about 70 million barrels per day. 10 million barrels per day is 15%. Try taking out 15% of your blood over a short period of time and see if you can get up off the floor. That's what we're talking about, because crude oil is the lifeblood of the world's industrial economy. And we're talking about taking out 10 million barrels per day over a short period of time. Oh, and then taking out some more over a short period of time, and then taking out some more over a short period of time. I showed you the graph for a 4% annual decline rate. The Pentagon assumes a 5.5% annual decline rate. The International Energy Agency assumes a 9.1% annual decline rate, and Iran's oil minister assumes a 10% annual decline rate. So those are huge numbers. Significant cultural disruption is represented by the U.S. Army with their Unified Quest 2011 document reporting to the world that they were preparing to implement martial law in the United States. I have no doubt the United States Army has been preparing to implement martial law in the United States for years, but they don't go around telling people. The element of surprise? Have they not read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? Come on. But here they are telling people that we're preparing for martial law in the United States. National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 was signed by President Barack Obama on the New Year's Eve when nobody was noticing. And it does a couple of pretty important things. It suspends habeas corpus for the first time in peacetime since the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. That's kind of a big deal. It allows the President of the United States to send out an assassination order to anybody he wants because he suspects them of being a terrorist. He has an assassination czar, a guy named John Brennan, who brings to him from his staff every week an assassination list. President Obama, here's the people we need to assassinate. A month ago, one of the names on the list was a 17-year-old girl, a U.S. citizen living in the United States. She had ties to terrorism. That's all it takes. The National Defense Authorization Act was thrown out by a lower court, but as nearly as I can tell, the executive branch is still pursuing it and will continue to do so until it goes all the way through the court system. At some point, peak oil leads to what I call the Greatest Depression. There will be massive unemployment. If there's a government around keeping the statistics on unemployment, they'll be reporting that we're at 30%. But in fact, nobody will have a job because money won't matter. Let me rephrase that. Everybody will have a job. Everybody will be working. It's just that you won't be paid in fiat currency. What that means is there will be very little of the distillates of crude oil we've come to expect, which is bizarre when you consider that what we've come to expect for the last 100 years or so is completely new in the history of the human experience. So what that means is no food at the grocery store, no fossil fuels for air conditioning or heat or lights, and no water coming out of the municipal taps. This is what those 80 or so people are predicting by the end of this year. I'm not making any predictions involving timing. I am not suggesting that it'll be lights out by the end of this year, but it certainly is believable. So I'm making no forecasts involving timing today. So what this means is the end of industrial civilization, and I want to remind you why that's such good news. It will slow or stop climate chaos. Only economic collapse will prevent runaway greenhouse. If we don't reduce emissions by 80 to 90%, we lock in human extinction within a single human generation. If that's not good enough reason for you, we terminate human population overshoot. Everybody who's born dies. Currently, we add 205,000 people a day to the planet. That's 1.5 million people a week we add to the planet. That's births minus deaths. Every one of those people dies. And it looks like a whole bunch of those people are going to die horrible deaths. We'll either kill them with a drone from the United States government, or they'll die of hunger or thirst. That's the world we're heading for. So let's stop adding 1.5 million people a day for whom we don't have food and water and decent air and energy and on and on. We might slow or stop the 6th great extinction. 30% of the world's species have gone extinct in the last 40 years. And currently we drive to extinction some 150 to 200 species a day. Every single day. That's genocide. We're killing species as if we have the right. People tell me all the time, yeah, but it's just like insects and bugs and stuff, right? I say, yeah, it's just like insects and bugs and stuff. Like, as Albert Einstein pointed out many years ago, 1 year without bees means the next year without people. those little bugs and stuff are kind of handy for things like pollination and decomposition. And finally, economic collapse is good news because it will allow us to terminate environmental decay. Every year of my life, 52 years so far, the world has been worse than the year before. Every single year. Every year we've dumped more of the world's soil into the world's oceans. Every year we've fouled more air and dirtied more water. Every year we've driven to extinction more species. Every year we've lost more salmon and more carnivores. Every year it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse as we ratchet up climate chaos, as we ratchet up human population overshoot, as we ratchet up the 6th grade extinction. And everybody I know thinks the world is getting better every year because we have smartphones. What we have in the United States, and as nearly as I can tell, what every other country is trying to produce for themselves, is the very antithesis of a durable set of living arrangements. Built on an industrial economy built on personal consumption. In the United States, 70% of the industrial economy is underlain by personal consumption. What did George W. Bush say in the wake of 9/11? Go to the mall. Got to spend our way out of this. But when you look at the definitions of consume, it doesn't look like that sweet a deal to me. To waste or burn away, to perish, to do away with completely, to destroy. Those don't sound like such great things, but that's what is required if you're going to have a set of living arrangements that requires you to live far from where you work, far from where you play, far from where you shop. So you have to use up the world's planetary resources as quickly as possible. What that means is, in the United States, we require obedience at home, oppression abroad, and whole-scale destruction of the living planet on which we depend for our lives. A couple of examples of obedience at home. This is a small town in Alabama in the southeast United States in the wake of the great financial crisis. And local citizens legally protested illegal actions by their banks. And in response, the United States National Guard was illegally brought in to quash the protests. Another example, when George W. Bush was running for president of the United States in the year 2000, he would speak on college campuses, and frequently, although it was massively underreported, frequently a lone student would stand up and express his First Amendment rights to freedom of expression, turn his back on the future president of the United States, and stand there in silent protest. And other students would notice, and they'd stand up and turn their backs too. And it wasn't long before a quarter or a third of the students in the audience had their back turned on the future president of the United States. That's 2000. 2010, 71-year-old Ray McGovern, ex-CIA analyst who had prepared the daily intelligence briefing for 4 United States presidents, was listening to a speech in Washington, D.C. by Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. And Ray McGovern stood up. This is a well-known figure in Washington, D.C. He stood up and turned his back on the United States Secretary of State and expressed his First Amendment right to freedom of expression, quietly turning his back. He was beat bloody and thrown in jail. What a difference a decade makes. Oppression, of course, we all know what the United States does to get its oil. The last decent man in the Oval Office, in my opinion, was a guy named Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, based on his daily actions, was a decent man. But he is known for the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine says, with respect to the Middle East, that's our oil over there. Jimmy Carter is the Marcus Aurelius of the United States empire. He knew what it takes to maintain an empire in decline. So he did his job. And I've already mentioned the 150 to 200 species a day we're driving to extinction to prop up the economy. The trouble is that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. I recognized my accountability in this irredeemably corrupt system, and I walked away. A tenured full professor, by the time I was 40, I'd reached the pinnacle of the educational world in a family filled with lifelong educators. And to the shock and chagrin of my parents and brother and sister, I walked away from that life because that was the first step I could take to stop participating in this irredeemably corrupt system. There are others that I've taken as well. We can talk about those later if you'd like. If we're going to develop a durable set of living arrangements in light of energy decline or economic collapse, in light of climate chaos, we need to recognize that the industrial economy is a subset of the environment, not the other way around, as any typical neoclassical economist will tell you. The typical neoclassical economist will tell you we need to get rich so we can have enough money to protect the environment. This is one of Kim Hill's first questions when I spoke to her yesterday for an interview this Saturday morning on New Zealand radio. When I spoke, I used to go around telling people, if you think the economy is more important than the environment, try holding your breath while counting your money. But I'd say that, and people would they'd hold their breaths, and they'd take out their wallet, and they'd count their money, and they'd put it away, and they'd say, what else you got? Nobody has any money anymore. Durable living requires only local materials, no exports, no imports. Globalization is on the way out, and that's a good thing. We must consume materials at the rate they are produced. Currently, we're consuming soils and clean water and, of course, fossil fuels at a far more rapid rate than they are being generated by Earth's natural processes. And finally, we must rely on our local human community for support. In fact, what thriving humans need is clean water, healthy food, the ability to maintain body temperature, and decent human communities. That's all. That's all we need. That's all we've ever needed. For the first 2 million years of the human experience, we were convinced that's all we needed. It's only been within the last 150 years or so, or if you look at the rise of the first civilization, within the last few thousand years, that we have become convinced that we need more. More, always more. But we don't. If we are to thrive, and not merely survive, but actually thrive during any era, we need water, food, the ability to keep our bodies warm, and a decent human community. And we can do that. However, if you present these ideas to your friends, you can expect that they won't be your friends for long. Those who are able to see beyond the shadows and lies of their culture will never be understood, let alone believed by the masses. So, what I'm suggesting to you is you have a hard uphill road ahead of you. However, if you want to get started, I have just a few examples of how we generate water, clean water coming out of the ground or out of the air, and how we create and maintain decent human communities where I live on a rock pile in the desert in the southwestern United States. As an aside, it has rained 225 millimeters there since September 24th, 2010. So it's dry. It's crackling dry. In fact, I flew into New Plymouth, and the rain was coming down horizontally, and I went from the plane to the terminal, and I received more rain than I have in the last 2 years. So I got all of my clothes and put them in the rain. I'm going to take it back. There's a wring it out on the plants. I'm going to import water. So we have the static water level on this property is 6 meters, which is pretty shallow. And so we use solar pumps to extract it and store it in 12,000 liter cisterns. We also have a hand pump running down beside one of the 2 solar pumps we have. The solar pump goes 90 feet down. That's 30 meters down this 35 meter well. And the hand pump goes down about 15 meters down the same well. We also harvest rainwater off the roofs on the property, and I've seen a lot of this in this country just driving around. Again, a 12,000 liter cistern that harvests the water off of the roof, in fact off 2 roofs on the property there. As an aside, this photo inadvertently shows my post-carbon transportation. Now I know it looks small, but as I understand it, people shrink when they get older. Hope to live a long time. And then our sixth source of water, after the 2 solar pumps, the hand pump, the 2 cisterns harvesting water off the roof, is the one that people used for the first 10,000 years people were there. and that's the perennially flowing river 400 meters away. And unlike the people who were living there for the previous 10,000 years, we don't have to hollow out a gourd and carry it down there to bring our water. We have all this amazing technology like cups and thermoses. It's great stuff. So things will be a lot easier this time around than they were last time around. With respect to community, we've invested heavily in the kinds of simple machines that will allow our community members to muddle through better than they might otherwise muddle. So we have a pretty large PV solar system that will allow people to use simple hand drills for minor construction activities. We have an old-fashioned but new wood-fired cook stove, an earth oven or an Orno, and I've seen these around New Zealand as well, and an old-fashioned hand grinding mill. That's the handle right there. And I used it twice, and my bicep got big, compared to the other one, and I'm lazy. So I bought an evaporative cooling fan motor and a fan belt and hooked it up to the PV solar system. I can't stand that sort of asymmetry in my biceps in my life. If I'm successful today, you will soon turn to the person next to you and say, what are we going to do? What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we do next week? What shall we do next month? What shall we do to make the world a better place for our children and grandchildren? What shall we do to mitigate for climate change and economic collapse whenever they come? What can we do as individuals? What can we do as members of our community? And those communities, for most of us, are twofold, professional and personal communities. Most of us have two sets of communities that we work within. So with that, I would be ecstatic to answer any questions or address any comments you might have. Thank you very much.